This is the armor you need. Bring a lot of very stealthy, high explosive stratagems, avoid extermination missions, and prep for launch. I have scoured a lot of videos and content to try to piece together how this game's stealth and detection works, and have come to an incredibly aggravating conclusion. The Helldivers community doesn't know what stats are. Every question you could possibly ask is answered with "I think" and "in my experience" answers, which are all conflicting hearsay and conjecture, and so are useless. Trying to work out how enemy detection and detection propagation works, or if the latter even exists, has been a nightmarish hell, and it doesn't help when the game is actively breaking around me all the time. I experience so many bugs while playing this game that if I were to include them all, this video would bloat 10 minutes, so there'll be a bug compilation released separate from this video. Here is my current working theory for how enemy detection works at the time of writing. All enemies seem to have their detection of the player tracked separately before they enter active combat. There is no grouping of units together where their knowledge and detection is chained, even for patrols, though it can seem like this because enemies seeing their allies in combat gets them active as well. This is unlike, say, Metal Gear Solid 5, where all outposts and by extension active and alert enemies work on Hiveminds that all share information. To explain why I think this, see here. Sometimes, even in the midst of combat, you'll find a bot that's remained somehow unalerted and tries to detect you before firing, even when its comrades are actively in combat near them. I know patrols don't have chain detection either because I have this example where I managed to get the attention of only half of a patrol. And because this game can't go a single mission without a bug, after they check out the sound and conclude there's nothing there, they're pathing to get back to their patrol, bugs, and they just evaporate. I have a lot more countless examples to give, but I don't want to waste your time with every single edge case that I analyzed. It's very possible some of the information in this video is incorrect, as I don't have access to the source code or anything, but given that I went through around 40 to 50 hours of footage to figure out how the stealth works, it's definitely going to be at least applicable advice. And that journey of discovery was all born by trying to understand why these guys were trying to detect me in the middle of combat. I believe enemies have 4 possible states, the first being unalerted, like you'll see with wandering patrols and garrisoning forces. They either stick to their predetermined route or stand still, and they have to detect the player. Then they could be searching, which happens upon hearing sound. They walk towards where the sound came from, and upon making visual contact with a player, will have to detect them still. The third state I'll refer to as active, and I'm almost certain the trigger for this is seeing an ally in combat. It's very similar to their searching state, the only difference is that they don't have to go through the detection animation and go into combat immediately upon seeing a player. They can be in this active state extremely briefly, like half a second briefly in a lot of cases. Here's an example. They hear a sound, go into searching and turn around, see their friend in combat to go active, and then see me right after and go into combat. I think it's this complicated because there are some edge cases that would be completely inexplicable if the system was simpler, like those bots trying to detect people when they really shouldn't need to. If, after an enemy finishes searching in either their normal searching or active states, and they don't find anything, they either go back to their post or, more often, bug the absolute fuck out. I've seen enemies start doing the can in frustration, I've seen enemies run in circles and stop responding to sound even in the middle of war zones. Melee enemies in particular seem very prone to mental breakdowns, and in general seem to operate on different rules which can fuck you over. These double-bladed melee dudes seem to detect players instantaneously, and in this clip I just grazed his detection range, he spots me, and his friends notice him in combat, and immediately start firing on me too. This game is held together with the same magic that Bungie used to get Halo 2 out of the door. The last fourth state is just active combat mode, where enemies can attack you freely and will advance towards you or where they think you are. As far as I can tell, enemies have 3 ways of entering this state. The first is the most obvious to notice from our perspective, a player shooting in their direction. I'm not sure how strict this is, it most likely checks if there are any enemies within X angles of where you're aiming when you fire and activates them, but I'm not sure. This is not based off sound, because bots cannot go into combat mode off sound alone, as previous examples with inexplicable unalerted bots show. That, and you can shoot much closer to bots without alerting them, as long as you're not aiming at them. I also have this clip of me taking out a set of enemies, and a guy in the next country away just happened to be within my sight picture, and so immediately called for reinforcements. The second trigger for enemies to go into combat is incredibly inconsistent, but having an offensive stratagem be deployed near them seems to be a trigger for combat, and may be responsible for the endless enemy range bug, which I'll talk about later. The third is obvious, which is getting close enough to be detected. When this happens, I suspect it might put bots within a radius into combat mode as well, but what I think is much more likely is the following. I'm 99% sure that a very significant trigger for bots is seeing one of their comrades attacking a player. It's what I believe makes them either become active or just straight up be put into combat. This only triggers if they see their comrade's body, not the weapon's fire. Note that this is only within a bot's standard visual range of around 65 meters, and its usual insanely narrow detection cone still applies, which is why you can sometimes come across patrols getting shot at who don't care at all, and will sometimes see bots try to detect you when their friends 90 degrees away are shooting directly at you. Here's what I suspect is different between whether it makes the bot go straight up into combat or just active. When they see a friend lighting you up, they probably make a line of sight check to see if they have an unobstructed view of you. If yes, go into combat, and if no, go searching for your last known location, which is most likely where you last fired at an enemy. In this clip, I get shot at, and someone I can't see calls in a dropship. That heavily implies enemies can get made active by sound alone, but this is not true. That guy got activated by seeing his buddy shoot me, and I have many examples of bots being able to call in dropships when just being active and not in combat. Bots need a visual combat with either a player or another bot attacking a player to go into combat mode. This is honestly most likely why the game doesn't have suppressed weapons. It'd make people realize that all weapons are kind of effectively suppressed anyway, and reveal how irrelevant sound is to the stealth system. Seriously, the sound produced by small and large arms fire is ridiculously low. I'm not sure the exact range and suspect it probably changes based on weapon, but it's much closer than you think it is, and I always operate assuming it's around 40 meters or so. As you can see in this clip, all airstrikes are effectively completely silent, as patrols don't care about them at all, and won't ever get drawn to them. They don't get drawn to objectives either, it's just that some objective phases spawn a fresh patrol out of thin air to ruin your day, but after they're dealt with, no one else cares. What is confusing about this is that the direction that you aim is way more important than anything else, which can certainly make it feel like sound propagates incredibly far. Sound really is an irrelevant mechanic, as evidenced by how you can't bait enemies with grenades, because once the explosion goes off, it seems to count as an attack, which updates your last known position, and so they know exactly where you are rather than investigating the grenade. Okay, now time to see if you can bait people with grenades. Didn't react to it. To recap, enemies have 4 states: idle, searching, active, and combat. A lot of their decision making is based on your last known position, which seems to update probably globally for all enemies currently in combat, most often when you shoot at enemies rather than any sound you make, because the sound radius of guns is incredibly low. Enemies can have different last known positions from each other, as evidenced by this clip where a heavy devastator is shooting right at me because he saw me, but because I haven't fired, the patrol I just dodged is still searching for me. Here's a rough, in general flowchart of what enemies do when they're in combat. When in combat, enemies see if there are any players within their visual range, which are the same ranges used for stealth detection, and shoot them. If there are, I suspect they can shoot at you accurately until you break line of sight. If they don't see anyone, they advance on their last known location, sometimes while blind firing at it. Players' last known location markers are updated when players fire their weapons at enemies, even when that range is way outside the weapon's sound range or the bot's visual range. This is why people assume they can be seen from much longer ranges than they actually can be. Enemies just love firing at nothing. The other reason is that there is an associated bug where an enemy will shoot at you endlessly regardless of range. I'm not entirely sure what causes this, but I suspect it has to do with enemies activated by stratagems, or a line of sight check going haywire. My best guess is that these enemies are initially put into combat while you're outside of their sight range, and as you never leave their visual range, because you were out of it to begin with, the flag that the enemy can see you is never switched off, and so they fire at you endlessly. That's my speculation as to why this can happen anyway, and there's no way this isn't a bug, because it stops if they get staggered, or if you enter and then leave their visual range. As for the guys who try to detect you in the middle of combat, I think this happens because these guys tunnel vision at walls or whatever so hard that they don't see their friends attacking people. They can't go into combat from sound alone, and so they have to see someone attacking, and they just happen to not. That's why these guys are typically from patrols that are coming past a line of sight blocker like a hill or a building. Stealth in general is a mechanic that seems not half-baked because it definitely has full implementation, but at the very least it's terribly communicated. At the best of times, it's like playing Metal Gear Solid 5 with no HUD. No enemy detection indicators, no enemy marking, no easily understandable barks that communicate what the enemy are doing. I have played Metal Gear Solid 5 this way, and it is a lot of fun, but you are clearly intended to have the HUD, and playing without it is kind of aggravating. In Helldivers, that is the only option. The reason no one, as far as I can tell, has realized any of the things that I've mentioned yet is because it's all a little unintuitive as shit, and very hard to notice in normal gameplay due to the lack of any stealth aids like HUD. Bots will hear the sound of their friends shooting, look at them doing it, and then alert, and from the player's perspective, that really does just seem like they alerted off of sound. The average person really doesn't need to know these things, but they're extremely vital for solo play. And fair warning, learning how to properly exploit these mechanics might push you into a playstyle most people would consider anti-fun, where you're avoiding combat rather than jumping into it at every opportunity, but that's their problem. But my real warning is that learning how to exploit these mechanics can kind of make the game extremely trivial, regardless of difficulty. Ultimately, your goal is to do objectives and not kill bots. By yourself, missions that require you to sit in one place and kill a lot of people are comedically difficult, relative to missions that boil down to running around and throwing Lockheed Martin Pokeballs on things. Some mission types like Exterminate border on impossible by yourself, but conveniently they're also basically unlosable with other people. The most important thing that I can stress when you're on your own is the degree to which the enemy relies on you shooting to know where you are. Simply not shooting while retreating increases the likelihood that you'll lose your pursuers by an order of magnitude. Keeping your radar up at all times is a must, and playing with a nuclear radar upgrade, optionally combined with the radar enhancement boost, feels like playing a whole different game. It constantly pings enemies around you in a huge radius, and so you can always take engagements on your own terms. You'd be surprised how close you can get to patrols, even standing as long as you're parallel to them, so you have a lot more options for traversal than you might think. I seriously do want to hammer this home. I have so many clips of me running by patrols who don't notice me whatsoever because their detection cones are so narrow, and even if they do, you can press one button to instantly have the range you can be detected from. This is still true for unactivated patrols if you're running away from combat, as they won't notice their allies' gunfire at all. Avoiding patrols is a remarkably simple process thanks to the generosity of the detection rules. You can freely sprint around, and as soon as you hear a robot speak Polish, spam your prone button. If your diver refuses to prone for no reason because the game sucks, dive and hope you don't ragdoll. Spamming dives actually makes you remarkably fast, especially in unfortunate weather conditions, and quite fittingly means you can even get into the loop of doing the old overpowered crouch dive loop from Metal Gear Solid 5, though it's not quite as fast as that game. Robots like to talk to themselves and each other all the time, so make sure you get into your head that this is the telltale detection sound that you have to look out for. If you do get detected, the best way out of detection is a little unintuitive. It may seem like running away is the best option, and it definitely can be if you have some major line of sight blockers to abuse like conveniently placed mountains, but a lot of the time you won't, and running will run directly into more enemies, which makes everything worse. If things are already like really bad, the best way to regain stealth in a nightmare situation is to stand still and fucking murder everything. Practice your Mecha Tenko-jutsu, use the overpowered autocannon, just commit a real Boston massacre until all alerted enemies are dead. If you put an enemy into combat, it's best to murder it most of the time. Not universally though, running away is valid. It's not hard to break visual contact, and when you do, enemies will run, and most of the time permanently plant their feet, at the last place you were seen or fired at an enemy. It's not hard to see this behavior either. These guys aren't going anywhere and can be ignored most of the time. You are required to commit murder at points because bots love standing on objectives and places of interest. Your target priority is equally unintuitive because you want to shoot the weakest enemies first. Any who look like normal-sized humanoids can call in dropships, and you do not want that. It's hard to overstate just how much easier objectives can be if you somehow stop them from getting a flare off. Most of the time, due to the layout of large bases, I think it's probably impossible without 4 people and a lot of communication. There's not really anywhere that you can sit that gives you sight of all enemies in most of these bases, and even if there was, good luck getting to it and then sniping all of the troopers in under 3 seconds. It is definitely possible to do with small groups that hang around places of interest though, and you do not want them to fire off a flare. Try to find a place to execute them all in one clean sweep with no enemies behind them so you don't have any accidental activations, and then you can deal with the devastators and whatever else afterwards. You can take out groups one by one so long as you kill them at an angle where no one was behind them, which is quite silly. All of these rules apply on all mission types. You might assume like I did that enemies are just omniscient on defense missions, but no. The size of the map does of course make it impossible to play perfectly stealthy, but you can abuse the way enemies blind fire to get them to kill each other. In this clip I fire at the giant horde, and even though they're through a wall, it updates my last known position and thus where they're blind firing, which is really low down on the wall, and so the rocket devastators promptly kill everyone. With bots, there is some bullshit you're gonna have to be aware of with gunships, striders, and mortars. On higher difficulties, they just blatantly cheat and know where you are the vast majority of the time. The standard detection rules don't apply for them, and when you're within a certain radius around a gunship spawner and or a mortar, it doesn't matter if you've yet to be detected. Fuck you. When you start objectives like most noticeably evac, it spawns a patrol 125 meters away which is oriented towards an outpost or map edge who walk towards you. When you call evac, there's a 50-50 chance that the enemies will get sudden ESP and know exactly where you are, no matter of how well hidden you are. I have no idea why this only happens sometimes. After a factory strider wakes up, they seem to be able to know where you are indefinitely, which is really cool and awesome. They can also shove their head into terrain to shoot through it, which is extra cool and awesome. This is why I made a bug compilation. Stealth is applicable to Terminids as well, though not one-to-one. You can absolutely bait them by shooting and you can avoid patrols, but it's hard to make out when they're detecting you because they like to gurgle by themselves a lot. And due to how many bugs are melee only, their missions are much easier in my experience, so I won't be covering them in detail. I have found all of this advice to be helpful even when playing with other people. You can pretty safely leave your team alone and go off to collect samples, super credits, and medals by visiting all of the places of interest, and maybe even do an objective or two if it doesn't spawn a patrol in the process. Really, the most important rule to learn how to abuse is how enemies are activated by a player firing. Good trigger discipline makes this game so much easier, as you will be pulling so many less enemies to fight. Ensuring that no one is past where you're shooting is on its own the easiest advice to put into practice, and the most effective. The last thing to cover for solo play is Loadout. The stealth armor is really the only must-have, and I personally find the radar enhancement to be as well. The rest is largely personal preference, though you might want to avoid using one of the guard dogs unless you like activating patrols on accident. I have found the orbital laser and 380 to be way too good to pass up, but I'm interested to hear what other people have found success with. Are doing the defense missions even physically possible on your own? Because I seriously doubt it. Originally, I was going to continue here and talk about difficulty choices because people seem to way overstate the differences between them, but this video is getting too long, and so that'll be its own thing. Just know that a trivial mission is surprisingly similar to a Helldive in some ways. Subscribe if you want to know more about that, I guess. Thanks to my patrons, and me especially. Like, comment, subscribe, you know the drill, and have a good night.